This is Cosmos from Soma Labs. Unlike regular loopers, Cosmos records multiple loops at the same time in stereo, each at a slightly different length. As these loops play back, the length offset results in something almost but not quite entirely unlike what you feed it. You can then freely play on top of those evolving loops without adding anything to them, or layer additional sounds into these loops while they continue to phase against each other. Cosmos also does a few other interesting things, all of which I'll take a close look in this video, including its different algorithms, other features, as well as pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Soma sent Cosmos over for review, but as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and store affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. More of this cosmic drift at the end of this video. Let's get started. Okay, let's start with an overview. Cosmos is a stereo effects unit, meaning it doesn't generate any sound on its own. It has 2 1/4-inch inputs and 2 1/4-inch outputs, as well as a 1/4-inch stereo headphone jack, and a USB-A port for firmware updates, but not for audio or for MIDI. The overall build is excellent. It has a metal enclosure, no wobble on the knobs, and the stomp switches are very easy to press if you're using Cosmos on a desktop, which is especially important since there are a few shift functions here that require pressing 2 stomp switches to change certain settings. And since the stomp switches don't require a lot of force, these can be easily done with one hand. At the heart of Cosmos is this selector that lets you choose between 4 different algorithms, 1 algorithm per quadrant. You've got 2 phased looping style algorithms, and then a reverb-like algorithm and a granular effect. The little dashes give you an indication of how many delay lines or copies of the source audio each algorithm has, and the 3 circles give you an idea of the size of each delay space, or grain in the case of the granular algorithm. Aside from the algorithm dial, you've got level controls on the inputs and outputs with companion overload LEDs. Blur and drift give you different controls based on which algorithm you're using. Drive is self-explanatory, and on the right you've got a suppressor compressor knob, which I'll explain later on, feedback level, just like regular delays, and a dry-wet mix. On the bottom, you've got 5 stomp switches, 2 stomp switches for filtering, a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter, each with 3 positions. This is the lowest frequency, 1 LED, and then if you hit select and the high-pass filter, you can increase the high-pass filter frequency up to the maximum level or maximum high-pass filtering. Same goes for the low-pass filter. You've got the lowest frequency, which is the most amount of filtering, and you can increase that to the highest frequency, which is the least amount of filtering for a low-pass filter. Reverse will reverse the buffer. And then you can play on top of it. Every tap reverses the buffer again, so it's more of a toggle. And then record is pretty self-explanatory. Opens the buffers up for recording. If you long press it for 5 seconds, it toggles a mode that cuts in half the buffer playback speed, pitching it down an octave. The LEDs blink to show you you're in slow mode, and anything recorded into the loop in slow mode will be sped up and pitched up an octave when you return to the regular speed. So that's it for the overview. Before I dive into the algorithms, a word about the setup. KeyStep is connected via MIDI to MEGAfm on channel 1 and to a computer over USB with different pianos on MIDI channels 3 and MIDI channel 5. The computer and MEGAfm are fed into a mixer that then goes directly into the stereo inputs of Cosmos, which then goes out to an Eventide H9. The H9 will be off for most of this video. It's just around for me to have fun while I was testing Cosmos. You don't necessarily need a reverb or any effect on Cosmos because it can get quite busy and reverberant on its own, but it's always fun to mangle the output even further. So with that said, let's jump right into the algorithms. On the bottom left quadrant is the 2 delays algorithm. It's pretty simple. Imagine 2 looper pedals, or delay lines, one initially panned hard left and another panned hard right, set to fixed loop lengths, except that one of these loops is slightly shorter than the other. So let's just play one note and take a listen to what we get with a 2.5 second buffer. One note, and then notice how the buffers are different lengths, so that one note gets offset between the left and right pans. Now if I play something more interesting, the patterns will play off each other in a more compelling and evolving way. Unlike regular delays or loopers, at least as of the current firmware, you can't set custom loop lengths, and you can't change the loop length offset between the 2 loops, how much one loop is slightly shorter than the other. Delay times are fixed at around 2.5 seconds, 9.5 seconds, and 22 seconds based on what you choose using the central dial, or double those times if you use the slow buffer mode. I asked Soma about this, and their thinking behind the fixed delay times as opposed to a custom loop length is that the loops will change drastically anyway the first time around, so letting you choose a custom loop length won't make much of a difference. I think it would have been nice to have that. Regardless, however, they are planning a future alternate firmware that's more rhythmically oriented and will let you adjust the loop length. That wasn't available for me to test as of the making of this video, but I'll share my thoughts about it when it comes out, either in a companion video or in the description below. The idea behind the 2 delays is very similar to the phased loop concept by Steve Reich. I made a whole video about that. Moving on to the 4 delays algorithm. It's similar to the 2 delay algorithm, only you get 2 phased loops per side for a total of 4 in stereo. With 4 delays, you get a cloud of notes sent back to you quicker than with the 2 delays. It has similar short delay time options, 2.5 seconds and 8.5 seconds. And a shorter 11-second maximum delay time. And yeah, as you can hear, it's very easy to get carried away in this. Okay, before we move ahead to the next 2 quadrants or algorithms, let's talk about the blur and drift knobs, because they work differently for these 2 quadrants than they do for the granular algorithm, and they have no impact at all on the giant reverb algorithm, at least as of the current firmware. It's easier to hear this with the 2 delay algorithm. So the drift knob is pretty simple. It gives you a non-destructive pan for both delay lines. So let's say, play this. Initially, each loop will play independently in each ear, but as we increase drift slowly and randomly pans the 2 delay lines in a non-destructive way, meaning that if we ever want the delay lines back panned hard left and right, we can simply turn the drift knob down back to 0. Blur, however, is destructive to the delay lines. As you increase blur, Cosmos will cross feedback between the delay algorithms, which leads to a gradual blurring of their content or intermingling of their content. So if you turn blur all the way back down, things won't be as they were when you initially recorded the loop. The end result of blur is different in the 2 delay algorithm compared to the 4 delay algorithm. In the 2 delay algorithm, eventually gradually leads to a certain rhythmic pattern. And with the 4 delays, the loops eventually evolve into a kind of unified texture or freeze effect. Probably hence the name blur. Okay, let's keep exploring the algorithms and move on to the giant reverb. Like I mentioned, blur and drift have no impact here. It doesn't sound like a typical reverb initially. Rather, you get a lot of echoes that eventually merge into a reverb-like texture. The larger dots represent larger halls, meaning the longer it takes for the initial reflections to come back, and the longer it takes for whatever is recorded to eventually morph into a texture, which can be a while. Moving on to the final quadrant is the granular delay, the last algorithm. Here, drift and blur are critical. If drift is all the way down, you'll only get grains from a single spot in your recording. Increasing drift will cause the position of the looping grains to start moving back and forth randomly across the loop. Blur randomizes the grain position. Grains can be either small or large, depending on the size of the circle. It's sort of like a time stretch feature, but due to the random jumbling of the grains, like everything in Cosmos, things quickly start to take on a life of their own and disintegrate. Okay, to complete the tour, let's talk about feedback and the suppressor compressor. Feedback works pretty much like any other delay. If it's at 1, the loop will continue at the same level. If you bring it up, loops will gradually increase in level. And if you bring it down, loops will fade out gradually or quickly. Feedback's next door neighbor is the suppressor compressor. This is basically a 2-in-1 knob. Counterclockwise from the middle, it's a suppressor, and clockwise from noon, it's a compressor. The compressor portion both adds gain and compresses, so you'll hear noise substantially more, and levels will increase overall, but the dynamic range will be reduced between noise and whatever's playing at a lower level and whatever was at a higher level. You'll notice overall levels increase here as well. And obviously drive, by the way, is something that impacts things substantially. And as gain increases, it starts to hit a limiter. So things do stay under control somewhat, but yeah, obviously drastically different than what you recorded. Left of noon on this knob going counterclockwise is the suppressor. This works very differently, kind of like sidechain compression. Not totally replacing, but just gradually making way for new audio depending on the position of the knob. The suppressor is a nice way to let old audio make way for new incoming audio as you play it. So that's it for the basics of Cosmos. Before I head out to the pros and cons, I wanted to share a few performance ideas I had after spending some time with it. First, even though Cosmos isn't designed in the current firmware to be a regular looper, you can use the 2-delay algorithm as a simple looper if you feed it audio in only one of the inputs. Just pan audio either left or right and make sure blur is all the way down so the two lines don't mix with each other. Now, delay times will still be fixed to whatever the knob is set to, but you'll get a simple loop. Obviously now it's panned just to one side, but with drift, I can bring it hopefully mostly to the center. And it's still that one loop. I could, by the way, now bring in a different instrument and record that to the other loop, but they won't obviously be the same length. Second little performance idea, if you want to introduce ideas when they're already phasing as opposed to just playing something and waiting for it to phase, just set the mix to all the way wet. You won't hear the idea the first time you play it, but when it comes back around, it'll already be phased. This trick also works very nicely for the granulator algorithm. So instead of hearing the audio first and then getting it granulated, you can immediately get a time-stretched or granular sound without hearing the dry audio. Third tip is I think that blur can be used as a really interesting generative tool. So play an idea and then start phasing the audio into a pattern that's generated by the blur. And when you like what you hear, turn blur down and it'll stop changing. But you've created a new pattern that's sort of on the way from no blur to becoming a texture, which I think is pretty cool. Fourth tip is that the high pass and low pass filters are great tools when things start to build up and you hear an accumulation either in high frequencies or low frequencies. You can use both the high pass and low pass to either filter out unwanted frequencies or make way for new content in certain frequency ranges. Next tip is just to explore how different algorithms interact with each other. So let's say that I've frozen this pattern. I could pass this on to any one of the other algorithms. Let's say the granular algorithm. Yeah. Pretty nice unexpected results. Next tip is to remember that reverse can be a really cool real-time toggle. It lets you play notes or chords and reverse them midway for, again, interesting and potentially unexpected results. And then a couple of practical tips. First is to remember to turn off record, especially if you're introducing new ideas. It's very easy to just leave recording on and keep layering on new sounds, but if you add something you're unsure of, there's no undo, no going back. So turn record off if you're about to get too experimental. And then my final tip is whenever you start a Cosmos session, always be recording. Sessions here are streams of consciousness that are very hard to repeat. It's not like every session is immediately album-grade material, but if magic occurs and there's a moment you want to get back to, if you didn't record it, it's going to be very hard to recreate. So with that said, let's talk about pros and cons for Cosmos. On the cons side is really something you should be aware of, otherwise you wouldn't be interested, at least in the current firmware. This is not a regular looper. I know that I showed a workaround earlier, but if you want something that will play back precisely what you put into it, loop it at a timing you choose, sync along with a beat, or loop a pattern of chord changes, Cosmos is quite literally designed to do the opposite of that. Like I mentioned, the manual states that a more rhythmic firmware will be coming along at some point in the future, so it would be interesting to see what that looks like. I'll comment on that in the description or in a new video if and when that comes out, so stay tuned. Beyond that, another thing you should be aware of is that there's no undo. So if you introduce something into the ambience you create and it doesn't fit in with whatever's going on, Cosmos will very quickly latch onto that and repeat your mistake back to you in many different generative and polyrhythmic ways. So turn recording off if you plan to experiment until you're ready to commit. And then finally, on the cons side, if you plan to use Cosmos with your feet on the floor as opposed to on a desktop, there's no expression or expander foot switch pedal support to extend knob control or shift functions to a pedal, meaning you'll need to bend down to adjust the knob-based parameters or to perform any of the stomp-based shift functions, which would be hard to do with 1 or 2 feet. So that's what I could think of in terms of cons, considering what this is designed to do. On the pros side, if you're looking for a generative audio mangler that will throw back at you something different than the ideas you put in, but in a way that's loosely related to those ideas, Cosmos is an excellent and, more importantly, very easy and user-friendly way to go about it. Soma set a goal for Cosmos to be unlike other loopers in two main ways, giving you back more than what you feed it and being a platform for freeform ambient experimentation without prepared sequences or backing tracks, and I think it delivers on this big time. It's very easy to get drawn into adding different layers, traveling between algorithms, bringing in new audio sources and letting old ones fade out in a state of flow where time goes by without you noticing as you travel from texture to texture. If you're into that kind of thing, Cosmos is well worth a look. Speaking of getting back more than what you put in, if you're into generative music, you should really check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Make sure to ring the subscription bell below if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.